makes me laugh because everybody here tonight spoke in cautious terms about technology, right? And instead, when I invited James Howard Kunstler, you know, the author and critic and future scholar, to come tonight as part of the audience, he wrote back, he shot back kind of a mean email saying, "What are you doing with all those techno-narcissists?" You should have been back. And he said it's so not true. So I would like to just ask for a moment, Dawn, are you there, Dawn Chan? Could you literally in like 3 minutes explain what Asia Futurism is? I just wanted to
Actually, I was going to ask Yatasha a question related to that. So
yeah, but first tell us just very little bit about Asia Futurism.
Okay, well, the way I was looking at it this summer in an article for Art Forum's identity issue was that I was looking at the gap between how often Asian people in the West are portrayed in these futuristic settings, the gap between that and how frequently they are excluded from portrayals of the present. And I was sort of contextualizing that in both Hollywood and the world of contemporary visual art. So it definitely posed sort of an interesting contrast to what I find so sort of admirable in a lot of Afrofuturist thinking, where, you know, as you talked about, you kind of get, it's a way for a group of people to create their own agency and, you know, I guess imagine their own fates.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to point that out because it was among the suggested readings. I'm sure that you read them all. Just in case, I wanted to point out this very interesting divergence between the Afrofuturism and Asian futurism. Well, since you have the mic, I'm going to let you ask the question.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess my answer had a bit of the question in it. Some of the challenge of what I was seeing in in sort of Asia futuristic thinking, some of the challenges were that Asia futurism seemed to encompass a lot of Western tropes and, I guess, you know, Orientalist modes of thought, techno-Orientalism, and ultimately there's a lot in Asia futurism that has to do with excluding a group from the present. So I guess my question for you is, how do you see Afrofuturism as, how do you see the movement maintaining its own agency and not becoming co-opted by other modes and other groups?
Well, I mean, I think we're in a society where a lot of things in culture get co-opted. And so that doesn't have to be terrible, but there just has to always be the active balance, right, of people who are creating various narratives and celebrating certain lines of thought because they do help people, you know, outside of just, you know, various commercial interests that might not have anything to do with transformation and a certain kind of evolution. So I think it's just about, you know, accepting that there will be a bit of both and creating avenues and ways to protect certain kinds of thought processes, ultimately so that everyone can engage in them. One of the big things in Afrofuturism, which I didn't mention, is that it talks about race as a technology, and race being something that was very much created largely to justify the transatlantic slave trade and some of the things that evolved as a result. And so obviously we've been changing a bit of that, but we still have this concept of race sort of being this socialized / biological thing. And so to me, when we talk about other futurisms, whether it's Asian futurism or Afrofuturism, and look at other perspectives on that, it continues to help chip away the sense of separation that we tend to put ourselves in.
We all talked in some ways about agency. And agency that was, we referred to citizens, we referred to agency for whole of society to build a future. But so many of us have very specific audiences, like we don't really interact with a wide audience. Well, maybe Yatasha reaches a wider audience because she uses means that are mediums that are accepted by more people. But I'm wondering, you shared with us the tools, and you are, Amy, exhorting us all to become futurists. How do we bring the idea of agency in the future to a wider audience from a podium like the one that Ari has, or Georgia has, or what do you think?
So my greatest concern for the future is not killer robots, and honest to God, it's not Donald Trump, although he is a terrifying person. My greatest fear for the future is that we have fetishized it. And I didn't talk about this, but there's I sort of was curious and did this study, and the word futurism and our fascination with it, and our fear, and then the sci-fi that results, and then, there's sort of like these steps that happen, and they happen with each instance of transformative technology. And if you go back to the late 1800s, during the sort of last days of night, it happens there. It was the Tesla and Westinghouse and Edison are having this huge fight over patents and alternating current and direct current. At one point, some dude that Edison is friends with decides to start staging these public demonstrations where he kills elephants and is shocking them with all of this power to prove that direct current is terrible, or alternating current is terrible. Anyway, my point is that it's not long after that modern sci-fi is born. And after modern sci-fi is born, you start seeing these big proclamations. And Ladies' Home Journal, one of the things that's in Dropbox for you, are predictions from 100 years ago, right? And anyhow, we cycle through. And what winds up happening is we fetishize, and then the future is here. And maybe it's not what we wanted. And that happens again and again and again. And AI is one of those conversations. Another one is the future of CRISPR and Cas9, which is a gene editing technique, which is not new. But it seems new because of this cycle that we're caught in, where we're routinely surprised and shocked. And then we feel powerless. We feel like we don't have agency at all. And then it becomes normalized within our society and culture, and then we move on to the next thing. And that's my fear. My fear is that we're not going to break free of this cycle. And the challenge is that technology is part of every single thing that we do. And it is more and more sophisticated and more complicated. And that's why I am so desperate to have everybody start making the future more boring. Mm-hmm. I'd like for you to be more bored, which is not to say to remove the creative process, but I would like for us all to stop being so surprised. Because the moment that we stop being surprised, and the moment that we are aware of what's happening, moment at that point we can participate. And once we are participating, then we are all, in a situation where we can create better futures for ourselves.
Ari, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, the work we do at Columbia and with different governments and in refugee camps is all about, to Amy's point, is all about participation and participatory. A lot of what we do is participatory democracy, but it's really participatory futures, right? And the idea that the future is this thing that's out there that others are in control of, which is this issue that I have with kind of techno-utopianism or techno-fetishization, where it's something like, I don't understand, so it's out there, so somebody's doing it. We try to pull that back and actually involve people. So one of the professors that I teach with at Columbia, she does a lot of work in Brazil on participatory budgeting, right? Which seems very boring and mundane and not very techno-centric. But it's really like you actually control the future in your own decisions that you make at the very kind of micro level of where do you want the town to put money towards this park or towards a new firehouse? And to Amy's point, it's boring, but that's it. That's where we have to go and bring people into that. And it's very much like the Burning Man ethos, right? Don't observe, participate. And we've moved into a very kind of observational culture, and bringing people back into a participatory one doesn't mean they necessarily have to participate in something that's way out there in the year, a 2030 type project. It can literally be in something in that week's work at the very kind of local democratic level.
Mm-hmm. And Georgia, in a way, you're trying to bring data to a much more intimate level. Data humanism is also about the kind of a slow data. You were talking about small, but it's almost slow data, like slow food. And data has been hailed as the basis for so much forecasting and short-term or medium-term thinking. So how do you transform this intimate approach to data into actual agency about the future?
Well, I think that like most of all, what also has been really striking for me with the resonance that Dear Data has had is, and I'm really just seconding you about the idea that we are almost in an observatory mode all the time, is the idea that makes people willing to be more active with their data. Because normally what you do is like passively applications and whatever kind of digital application collects data from you. And there's this thing that we expect an app to tell something revelatory about ourselves just by, you know, kind of like counting all of these things about you, and then you look at the chart and you learn something about yourself. But that's absolutely not true. And I really believe that we have to engage, every one of us really have to engage in sense making about data according to anyone's personal stories and personal context. And so the more we realize that data is actually a material that we can use to get to new knowledge and to get to new, also engaging parts of our life, as opposed to the ultimate and definitive answers to all of our questions. I think the more we will have agencies in understanding that data is the beginning of a conversation. And sometimes I think that like we've always tried to use data as a blunt end of the conversation. These are facts, these are data, we are done. But we are not there yet. Data is really not there yet, because what you decide to collect or left over to a data set really informs the course of its life. So that's, you know, a kind of like articulated answer to your question.
What did you call it? Peak information?
Peak infographics.
Oh,
I think
peak
we're
infographics,
after peak
completely.
I love that slide.
infographics.
Yeah, no. I usually call it drunkenness. So peak infographics is a little bit,
It's
yeah,
like
I don't know.
more
Because it's
elegant.
true. When there's a new technology, there's this drunkenness, and then you sober up and things start getting more elegant and respectful and better made.
Just to adapt to that, I mean, if I would had more time, I would have elaborated on that. But I believe that we're after this peak infographic because, like, so far, like, visual design has a lot being used only as a cosmetic retouch to problems, you know, data problems to make them look better. But on the other hand, we've been always like throw technology at the problem and produce this kind of like Minority Report dashboard. So, I mean, and that's not so bad because again, people are now more, we are more comfortable with data, with what data means, with the language that have been used to represent data, even if sometimes they have been misleading. So I believe it's a really good place to be, and the revolution with data and with big data, to me, still have to start.
Yatasha, it's interesting to see how science fiction, after a moment in which it was either dystopian or utopian, that's it, it was kind of binary, has become this arena for real world fighting and real struggle. I'm talking, for instance, of the phenomenon of sad puppies that you might want to explain to the audience if they don't know. Maybe because it's become more nuanced, not only nuanced in terms of cultural and ethnic background, but also nuanced in terms of the relationship with the past, you know, this idea of diachronic fiction. It's become really incredibly political, as you were explaining before. So sad puppies, maybe you want to say better what it is, because it's...
You can go into the sad puppies or whoever's more
No, go ahead.
learned. No, I'm not the best person to talk about sad puppies.
Oh, okay. No, but no, it's something that we don't like. Well, basically what I found out, and I didn't know it at all, that there's an alt-Republican wing to science fiction too. So there's a science fiction prize that happens every year that is kind of
And
by
they don't
popular
like
vote.
it when women are up for those awards.
Yeah, women or people of color. It's like they want to have white males in science fiction as protagonists of science fiction, and therefore they kind of do this denial of service attacks and pull up certain titles as opposed to others. But, right, did I describe it correctly? So it's very interesting because usually in the past, science fiction didn't used to be a political arena, and instead it's become really so.
Well, I think that's in part because of, it sort of proves the point that Afrofuturism brings up just simply by having the term Afrofuturism, that there's an idea of what the future looks like and who participates in that. There's an idea of what the norm is. And when Afrofuturism shifts that, not just in terms of representation of people of color, but also in terms of certain thought processes. I mean, the whole idea of bridging mysticism and technology in a science fiction novel, for some hardcore sci-fi people, you know, they would say that that's not acceptable. To talk about women's issues, you know, or to have a host of characters who are women and to really engage in this idea of the divine feminine, or you're looking at intuition, or, you know, you're talking about emotions and feelings as guidance narratives in the course of science fiction. I mean, for some, it forces certain kinds of readers to think about things they don't ordinarily think about. And so it's not comfortable. And you would say, oh, well, that's what science fiction is for, to make you think about things that you're not comfortable with, except for there has consistently been a certain kind of narrative that has been presented. That it's on one level, like I said, it's representation, but the other are ideas that come from other places. And sometimes it's just the concept that these ideas exist and have always existed that makes some people feel really, really uncomfortable.
And the truth is that the moment you start exposing the world to alternatives that are possible and preferable, the world moves towards them, you know, slowly but surely. So I think that also these kind of people see it as a danger to have that kind of possibility out in the open.
Mm-hmm. I think that, I mean, like so I gave the talk that I ran through in like 3.5 minutes is usually like an hour long. So I gave this to a group of 100 progressive faith leaders a little while ago. And so the conversation was around futures, but and I had given the Long Path talk in Silicon Valley 2 months before then. And it was amazing being in the room with technologists and then with progressive faith leaders in Atlanta a little bit while longer. And their visions and ideas of those narratives were vastly different. It was a very kind of human, non-hegemonic, non-white male future, which is exactly what I had a few months before in the Valley. And I don't want to, and it sounds like I'm being judgmental, it's just, but there's very different narratives at play. And I think the overarching narrative of what the future is actually so constrained right now and so limiting that it's doing a major disservice to society. And so the question is how, and that's why I love like anything that can kind of open that back up, be it from faith or from art, is unbelievably important right now in 2016 if we want to get through what I think is a narrowing of a possibility that we have right now as a civilization.
But this is important because one of the reasons why so many people think we're running towards the sixth extinction is because people are not able to see beyond their nose, their own lifetime, and maybe their children's lifetime. So bringing it to the level of a community, of a group's interest is a way to go. Which other ways do you use, which other means and tricks do you use to get your CEOs or your NGOs or your UNHCR commissioners, well, that's his job, I think, beyond high commissioner. Sorry, I forgot an H. Sometimes I always become, acronyms. And so how do you get people to think so long term if they don't have it in them already?
Like there's tactics and strategies, but a lot of when we talk about transgenerational thinking, it's actually a relief to a lot of people to know they don't have to fully solve something in their own lifetime, right? There's this kind of heavy existential angst about legacy and who am I and why am I here? And when we kind of bring that up and change the question from who am I and why am I here to who are we and why are we here, we find that opens up what they're able to think about. You know, there's this great story, and I'll do the 30-second version from the Talmud about this guy, Honi, the wise man, who's walking down a road and he sees an old man like in his 80s planting a carob tree. And he says to him, Honi says, why are you planting this carob tree? How long until it bears fruit? And he said, at least 30 or 40 years. And he says, well, you won't be around for this. And he goes, that's true, but when I was a young boy and a young man, there were many carob trees for me to take fruit from. Those were planted by my parents and by my grandparents. And so through stories like that, but the longer version and those kind of conversations, it allows leaders to see their role isn't, yes, they can solve, and they need to solve certain acute issues, but allows them to kind of expand what is possible and see it less as a sprint from like the start to a 100-meter dash, and much more as a relay. And recognizing their job is to be in that transition zone and hand the baton off and set the next runner up. And when we have that conversation, that allows them to see a range of possibilities that take them out of the short term, what's right in front of them.
I think one of the, just as humans, again, we are continually faced with this paradox of the present. And if we had a car company that wanted us to figure out not what's the future of cars, but what is the future of driving, right? Given what we know to be true in the year 2016. And the challenge is that you have to allow yourself a certain amount of chromatic ambidextry, which is to say that you have to be thinking about today, like that CEO, in order to be responsible to his shareholders and the people who work for him, has to think about risk, right? And risk is what we manage in the present and the near future, but you also have to think about where are we going? And it's that where are we going piece that's so challenging. So the very first part of our methodology is something you could all do. It's called a fringe sketch, something everybody should do. And that is that as you are thinking about the future of something, you sort of start, we have a set of guiding questions, but you start drawing circles and connecting the circles that sort of look like they should be connected together. And the goal with that is to not think about what's in your present circumstance, but to think much further out. So for example, if I was thinking about what's the future of driving, I would be looking at, the future. I mean, honestly, part of that would include the future of things like biomaterials, because maybe tires won't need to carry the same amount of weight because cars won't have the same amount of components. Therefore, I would look to places like the MIT Media Lab and to Neri, who's probably designing some kind of crazy new, biomolecular material that then changes X, Y, and Z. So the point is to really broaden the scope, but it's difficult to do that. It's difficult when you're confronted with day-to-day challenges to think about today, to think about a few years from now, and a few years after that, but you have to allow yourself to do all of those things, which again, we have different kinds of futures as a way to sort of plan through that. And this is the other important thing. Everybody wants the answer. And there is no answer. And that's a difficult pill to swallow, especially if you're an undersecretary of state, who we talk to, right? And if you're a CEO. You have to be comfortable with ambiguity. And so rather than seeking out the answer, you need to seek out the path. And be willing to adjust that path as you go along. And that's something that we are, especially as Americans, we like having the answer. We think we know the answer. And it's challenging for us to think in this different way, but it's essential. It's essential.
Questions from you? Yeah. Okay, Susan, she raised her hand before. So one here.
Wait for the microphone?
Yeah, it's coming.
Thank you all. It was amazing. One quick thought and then one question. I think to think boring, you need to have good stories that aren't boring. We've got too many competing Jetson narratives. And I think the Afrofuturism narrative and George's narratives are powerful as well. But the real thing that struck me was the short-termism. And you started to allude to how do you contend with short-termism. I would ask you to critique this proposition. I feel short-termism is endemic because we don't know history. And history has become completely unfashionable. Now, history doesn't have to be taught as chronological. It could be modes of thought that cycle through time. But if you don't have any sense of history, there's only the present. So I would be curious to hear you react.
I can't critique it because I agree with you 100%. I mean, and you said the second part that I was going to say was it's not just because our history is always like the history of the conqueror, right? So there's and it's always usually male, and so part of it is the facts of history, but it's there's a great, it was actually a book / PDF. It's kind of like I think it was called Manifesto of the History or Historian Manifesto about how to think historically and its impact and its role. And so I agree with you 100%. We completely. And I could give you a bunch of facts about how little Americans know about history, or let alone where Canada is on a map, let's say. so geography, but 100% without that sense of history. And this is what Doug, my friend Doug Rushkoff writes about this in Present Shock, right? If you lose the past, you lose the future. And we've so lost the path that we're stuck in this presentist moment. And there's a bunch of other reasons around that. But without that history, there's no way you're going to move forward.
Okay, please. By the way, I didn't ask Susan to introduce herself. That was Susan Yanovich. Can you please introduce yourself also?
Sure. My name is Sankop Bhatnagar. I'm a student at Parsons, the New School for Design. And so there's been a lot of talk tonight about how we future and how we envision the future and how we might sort of need to push ourselves to envision alternatives. And I'm wondering, what would be your recommendation for strategies for how the public might begin to challenge existing visions from corporations, from sci-fi, et cetera, so that we can begin to press possibility into existence?
Natasha, would you like to take that answer? It's not your comfort zone, but it might be interesting for that reason.
Right. Well, actually, I guess in some ways it might be because I like the use of the imagination. To me, that's what inspires action. So if you're thinking about a world you want to live in and you contemplate, you start slowly thinking about what that looks like, then, you know, moment by moment, you can peel away any kind of sense of limitation that you have in the present. So when I was working with a group of kids, they were, I believe, 5th graders, and they were kind of in a troubled neighborhood, and I wanted them to talk about the future, and they kept talking about violence. You know, I don't want to see any violence. You know, I don't want to see the violence. I don't want to see the violence. And pretty much every kid in the class was saying that. And I was expecting them to talk about spaceships and going to Mars and, you know, all sorts of shiny tech things. And at some point, you know, I had to get to, okay, well, you're telling me what you don't want to see. Tell me what you do want to see. You know, it's not as if that's the only thing you've seen your whole life. So what does that look like? And slowly they were able to talk about what a world without violence looks like. And they said, oh, we can go out and play outside all day, and we can do this, and we can do that. And then slowly it was, okay, well, what does that feel like? And then they started talking about what it felt like, because they felt, you know, a sense of peace, you know, throughout their life in various ways. So, and after you go through all that, then you could get into, they were talking about certain technologies or things they were curious about, or music. And at some point, you know, one girl raised her hand and she said, oh, so you're saying we can change the future? But it took almost, you know, an hour and a half, and these were kids. But I guess my point is that if you contemplate things that you would like to see, and stop thinking about what you don't want to see, but what you would like to see, and then slowly, you know, almost work backwards. Or think about, okay, well, what step could I take today, or what does it feel like to have that experience, and see if you can create a way to experience that in the present. And I think that'll spark other ideas.
And if I can add up to that very quickly, I really agree. And I think that all your point is also to try to reframe the questions. And like, I mean, I work with data. It's a very, very specific field, but I am a designer, and so I always kind of like have a design approach. And I always, you know, hear that design is solving problems, but I feel that like baking a design process like from the very beginning into any kind of problem actually is helping framing the right questions. So like, for example, with my clients, even though we work with like corporation, big banks, we always really, really try to use design from the very beginning, and a designer's approach that really can help you reframing the question. And I would also say that maybe what I would do is trying to get to an uncomfortable path. So something that is like, probably you will make a mistake, but it's something that is worth exploring. And yeah, so reframing questions. And if you feel that something is uncomfortable but can be explored, I will definitely go this way.
The easiest way to get out of the paradox of the present is to force yourself to explore things that you've never seen before. You know, there is a reason. So you mentioned the Jetsons and flying cars. There has literally been a handful of flying car models every single year, every single decade consistently since 1919. There are brand new flying car models today, a day in which we know that self-driving cars are just around the corner. Why are we still trying to design cars that can fly? The reason is because we have these cultural references. We should be spending, you know, everybody should be spending time in places like MoMA. and they should be spending time in nature, right? And getting outside of what we know, to be true from our own vantage point. And in doing that, we start to eliminate some of that belief bias in the paradox of the present, and we are able to unlock these other avenues for us to start thinking.
I was going to say, while you're getting the next part, there's a thing out of Arizona State University called the Hieroglyph Project. So much of what we think about what is going to be coming tomorrow comes from science fiction that hasn't, like tropes that haven't changed. So what the Hieroglyph Project did was they commissioned a lot of different artists and thinkers to think about and literally write new short science fiction stories, but in many ways had more of a kind of human center to them. And the idea being, so instead of thinking about what's the next flying car, the next tricorder, or the next top-down version, what does a bottom-up futures look like? And that was just through sci-fi. So, to your question about like we're working with a consortium of social justice organizations right now. First thing we did was we asked them write us headlines from the New York Times in 2030, but with you at the center of it, your organization at the center of it. Like, what did you do? And it's not about did you win or not, but through that conversation and driving kind of new narratives of where, and the interesting thing is a lot of people we had in the room were people who would no longer be at those organizations for various, where they were the EDs, and we were pushing them out. And by pushing kind of new stories, we were able to, one, as already said, start thinking about how to reverse engineer into that, even though there's a meandering path to that. But two, it was kind of a critical theory-based approach to modeling out different scenarios for them, but that they owned, as opposed to saying, like, these are the parameters that you have to work within. Where do you want to be? But we do that with our corporate clients. We do that with CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, with state and the White House and DOD. Like, we do it. And it sounds like such a simple exercise, but once you start doing that, you open them up and you open the conversation up to kind of more critical questions.
I like that, from children to CEO and Pentagon. I have you, but first there's the lady with the purple coat.
Hi.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Nancy Knox-Talcott. I have a question, and it sort of integrates what you're all talking about, and that is with the advent of so much more technology. To Amy's point, we shouldn't be as frightened, but there seems to be a passivity that has been encouraged by technology when you're talking about AI and the self-driving cars and things that are done for us. And I see, even in my own stepchildren, a real lack of curiosity and imagination, which is brought about somewhat by having all this information delivered at you, to you, 24/7. And I'm wondering how we reconcile the slow data, which is sort of reintegrating and reintroducing imagination and tactile, sort of hands-on, and the long-term philosophy with all this new information, all this technology. How do we bring the old with the new?
Georgia, do you want to take this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have a unique answer. What I believe is that we really still have to keep on exploring how to make all of this information that we generate all of the time by just like breathing, all of this information and data that we generate, how to make it more contextual to our lives. So of course the very tactile and small and analog experience that I was showing is just one possible very radical experiment, but in general, I think that we as designers, I mean, again, I'm not a futurist, I'm a person that tries to envision futures by making things and by seeing how they are received, is by keeping on exploring how to make this cold and impersonal field of data very personal and very meaningful to one's life. So find a way to reconnect it to one's personal experience. And then I think that starts the moment when people would understand that it's up to them to really make sense of all of the things that they are generating. And again, that they don't have to expect any kind of like web application software to really reveal something super interesting about themselves without an active act of sense making about that. And I just ultimately believe that technology has done an amazing, amazing job so far, but now, again, we are peak and past this peak, and it's really just the moment when all of us needs to just understand that it's up to us, ultimately, to find ways to make this number more meaningful.
Maria? Also introduce yourself.
Maria Popova. The theme, the name of the salon, Informed Future, strikes me as a little bit of an oxymoron, because information is only based on what's come before. And this question of how we look forward to the future and sculpt it together necessitates rising to the levels of meaning and wisdom, which require a leap of imagination beyond information. And I was thinking about James Baldwin and him saying that you have to tell the world how to treat you, and if the world tells you how you're going to be treated, you're in trouble. And today, we've outsourced so much of ourselves to the data about us, the information about us, and that's shaping how we come to perceive ourselves or how we're kind of portrayed outwardly. And so almost as if we've surrendered meaning to the statisticians and not the seers like Baldwin and the people who are able to make these leaps. So I guess I would love to know how you think about creating a culture that reclaims some of that from the realm of the statisticians and cultivates room for seers.
Well, I guess, from my point of view, it's the convergence of the two. So in the model, every futurist uses a different model. And in my model, up until about 3 years ago, it had 5 steps. And then I started picking it apart and trying to figure out, this is something that I've been doing for 11 years. And when I took a step back, I realized that I had somewhat inadvertently modeled, so sort of in a meta model way, I was using the Stanford D School's flare and focus model without sort of realizing that that's what was happening. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the D School has a philosophy of you have to sort of flare to get big ideas and to think broadly, but at some point you have to focus and narrow down. And to your point, the company that fascinates me most right now is Magic Leap. And it is precisely because they are seers and they are statisticians.
It's because nobody knows what
well,
they are.
but some some people know.
This mystique.
Some people know. So for those of you, the short end of the story is this is a very mysterious company that is in Florida that took over an old Motorola building. But I have read every single one of their patents, and they are fascinating. They are. You should read. You should read their patents. One of my favorite things I ever read was a 350-page patent that alternates between seeing and fact, between sci-fi, fantasy, and data. And they are describing essentially a set of glasses that have cameras in them that allow you to do all kinds of things. Like, we could have my grandmother sitting here, and it would seem as though to me like she's here, and it would seem as though to her that I was sitting in her living room in Chicago, and yet we are here with each other. The technology is one thing, but the point that I'm trying to make is that I think the great thing about the future is that we have not, or at least I have not, relegated it to statisticians. But I also don't think that it's a fantasy, because there are plenty of people out there who do this, who come up with these crazy, fantastical ideas, but act as though those are foregone conclusions. And instead, it's very much the intersection of these two things, which means that people who are exceptional at flaring are just as important as people who are exceptional at focusing. That the seers are just as important, and the creative people and the designers and the artists are just as important in crafting the future as the scientists and the mathematicians. It's really the convergence of these two. Yeah,
and it occurs to me that talking also about companies and big companies, one of the company that I believe is doing a really great job right now is IBM. So right now, maybe you all know that IBM is the biggest design company in the world. So they really revolutionated the way they work by hiring 500,000 designers in the, no, I'm sorry, yeah, 500?
1,000.
No, yeah, 1,500. I'm sorry,
1,500.
1,500.
Okay.
Well, it would be great, but 1,500 is a great number.
Okay,
Anyway,
yeah.
no, 1,500 designers in the last 2 years, and really completely changing the way they work. And I believe that, again, to your point, that's very true, because IBM is, of course, a very technology-based company, but now they're trying to shape a different future for the company and for their customers by this kind of hybridization, and I believe they're really doing a great job.
And those designers are working alongside the IBM Watson team.
Yeah.
And I can tell you something that is not, I guess it's public-ish. We're being live streamed.
Yeah.
It's probably okay. So they have built something called Debater. And Debater takes a corpus, which is another sort of fancy way of saying a bunch of data. And from that corpus, you can ask it a question, and it will give you all of the pros and all of the cons. Okay, so it will go through, synthesize, analyze all the information, and just as though you had sort of an oracle or somebody, some kind of helper.
It's like a paparatron.
Kind of,
Yeah.
kind of. Now, here is the interesting thing. So Debater right now uses Wikipedia as its corpus, and so nobody should trust Wikipedia, but if you ask it a question about gun violence in video games, it will give you the pros and the cons. Another thing that it will do is it will fact check in real time.
Nice.
And just like I was a high school and college competitive debater, so if any of you were like me, you'll know the significance of this. It can suss out who the opponent is, fact check in real time, and then think several steps ahead. And tactically have an argument, a debate with that person, knowing what that person is probably going to say. And guess who it's been tested against? Not me. No, that would have been awesome. No, but it rhymes with Schmalner Schrump. That was a... There you go. Okay, so obviously it wasn't ready in time. It rhymes with grump. Dump.
Dump.
So, that sort of thing would not have been possible with just computer scientists sitting in a lab. Yeah. That future that we are headed towards requires people like you and people like you, right? It requires these, seers and great thinkers and designers and people who think about, faith and religion and culture. And that's the beautiful thing about what they're building, yeah.
And just to conclude about IBM, Phil Gilbert, the head of designer, made the company uncomfortable, made all of the developers and the technologists uncomfortable by really, putting designers working side by side with them. And it was kind of like a bold choice, but I believe it's really great.
So I have to apologize, Philip, but you can continue afterwards. I have to close, unfortunately. But first of all, I would like to also thank Xaviera Cubara, who's the new R&D research assistant. She just started, so she also helped put together this PowerPoint and this night and all of my team. And I would like to thank you because you've been so absolutely awesome, and also you in the audience. And we're going to go outside and we can keep on drinking and we can keep on not talking about what's going to happen tomorrow. And I really am so happy that we reprised this habit of the salon. So until the next one, thank you so very much.